March 23, 1954, 8:47 a.m. The M7 bus traveling north on Lenox Avenue through Harlem, a crowded vehicle operated by the New York City Transit Authority, carrying approximately 60 passengers during morning rush hour when working people commuted to jobs throughout Manhattan, most of them domestic workers and laborers who earned wages far below what white workers received for similar employment, but who nonetheless traveled daily from Harlem's overcrowded apartments to wealthier neighborhoods where their labor maintained comfortable lifestyles. For families who rarely acknowledged their humanity or appreciated their sacrifices beyond the specific services they provided, the bus was nearly full, with standing passengers holding overhead straps and swaying as the vehicle stopped and started in heavy traffic. The atmosphere combining resigned exhaustion with quiet determination that characterized how Black New Yorkers approached daily indignities that white society barely noticed, because those were so routine and so systemic that they had become invisible to everyone except the people experiencing them constantly. Dorothy Mitchell sat in a seat approximately halfway back, holding her 4-year-old daughter, Angela, on her lap, the child sleeping peacefully despite the noise and motion that surrounded them. Her small body relaxed against her mother's chest in the kind of complete trust that young children display when they feel safe and protected by adults whose presence represents security and comfort that makes the world feel manageable, despite its dangers and unpredictability. Dorothy was 31 years old, a widow whose husband had died 2 years earlier in a construction accident that left her solely responsible for supporting Angela and for maintaining the small apartment in Harlem where they lived on Dorothy's income of $28 weekly from domestic work cleaning 3 different apartments for white families on the Upper East Side, who paid her $9 per apartment per week for 6 hours of labor scrubbing floors and washing dishes and dusting furniture and changing linens and performing all the household tasks that those families considered beneath their own dignity but essential for maintaining the comfortable living standards they enjoyed. The bus driver was Thomas Sullivan, a 46-year-old Irish-American from the Bronx who had worked for the Transit Authority for 18 years, driving various routes throughout Manhattan, but who had requested transfer to Harlem routes specifically because he enjoyed the power dynamics that came from controlling transportation for Black passengers who depended on his buses to reach their jobs, and who lacked realistic alternatives if they were denied service or treated poorly by drivers who used their authority to enforce informal racial hierarchies that persisted in New York, despite the fact that formal segregation had been illegal in the city's public transportation since 1873, when court decisions forced streetcar companies to abandon explicitly racist policies that had characterized earlier decades. Sullivan's racism was not unusual among Transit Authority employees in 1954, many of whom viewed Black passengers as inferior and deserving of disrespectful treatment that would never be directed toward white riders who used the same buses and subways and who expected and received courteous professional service from operators who understood that their jobs required maintaining positive relationships with customers. At the 125th Street stop, approximately 15 passengers attempted to board the already crowded bus, creating a situation where some people would need to stand despite limited space remaining for additional bodies and vehicle that had been designed to carry 60 passengers maximum but that routinely operated above capacity during rush hours when demand exceeded available transportation resources. Sullivan allowed 12 of the 15 waiting passengers to board before closing the doors and preparing to continue his route, leaving 3 disappointed people on the curb to wait for the next bus that might arrive in 10 or 15 minutes, depending on traffic and schedules, that were rarely maintained precisely during peak commuting periods. As Sullivan prepared to pull away from the curb, Angela woke suddenly and began crying, the kind of distressed crying that young children produce when they wake disoriented in unfamiliar circumstances and need reassurance from parents about where they are and why everything feels wrong despite being safe. If you've ever watched a child cry and seen adults around them react with either compassion or contempt, with either understanding that children have limited emotional regulation or anger that the child is creating disturbance in public space, leave a comment about the moment you realized that how people treat children reveals fundamental truths about their character and values, and subscribe to this channel because what you're about to witness is how one bus driver's racist contempt for a crying Black child triggered a response from Bumpy Johnson that would paralyze New York City's entire public transportation system without a single act of violence, proving once again that the most powerful victories come from strategic organizing rather than from individual retaliation against people who abuse whatever small authority society grants them. Dorothy immediately began comforting Angela, speaking softly and rocking her gently, while other passengers around them displayed the kind of sympathetic patience that people who understand the challenges of parenting typically show when children are upset in public spaces. But Thomas Sullivan responded very differently to Angela's crying, turning in his driver's seat to shout toward the back of the bus, in voice loud enough to be heard clearly by every passenger, despite the ambient noise of the vehicle and surrounding traffic. "Shut that kid up back there! I'm not driving this bus with some little monkey screaming and disturbing everyone. Either get that animal under control or get off my bus and wait for the next one." The words hung in the air for several seconds while passengers processed what they had just heard. The racist language and dehumanizing characterization of a 4-year-old child, so shocking and so cruel that even people accustomed to routine racism, experienced by black New Yorkers, felt stunned by the explicit hatred and casual cruelty displayed by bus driver who apparently felt completely comfortable expressing such sentiments publicly without fear of consequences or professional discipline. Dorothy's face flushed with combination of shame and rage. The shame coming from being publicly humiliated in front of 60 strangers who were now staring at her and her daughter. The rage coming from recognition that Sullivan had called her child a monkey and an animal in language designed to communicate that black people were subhuman and undeserving of basic respect or decent treatment from white authority figures who controlled access to essential services like public transportation. Angela's crying intensified in response to her mother's tension and to the loud, angry voice that had shattered the relative quiet of the bus interior, creating feedback loop where the child's distress increased Dorothy's stress, which increased the child's distress in cycle that would have been obvious to anyone with basic understanding of child psychology or simple human empathy. Dorothy spoke quietly to Angela while glaring at Sullivan, her voice controlled but carrying edge of barely suppressed anger. "It's okay, baby. We're almost home. Just a few more minutes and we'll be there." Sullivan apparently interpreted Dorothy's quiet response as insufficient compliance with his demand that the child stop crying immediately, because he put the bus in park despite being in middle of traffic lane, blocking vehicles behind him, and turned again to address Dorothy with even greater hostility. "I said, shut that kid up now, or get off this bus. I don't care if you're almost home. I don't care if you're late for work. I do when I care about anything, except getting that noise to stop so I can drive without having to listen to that shrieking. So you've got exactly 10 seconds to make that child quiet, or I am calling a supervisor and having you removed from this vehicle for creating a disturbance." The threat to call a supervisor and have Dorothy removed from the bus for the crime of having a crying child revealed Sullivan's confidence that his authority would be supported by transit authority management, that his racist characterization of a 4-year-old black child as a monkey and an animal would not be viewed as serious professional misconduct but rather as understandable frustration with passengers who failed to maintain order on his bus. 3 male passengers in the front section of the bus intervened. One of them, a middle-aged black man who worked as a porter at a hotel near Central Park and who had witnessed countless examples of how white service workers treated black customers versus how they treated white customers in situations where race was the only variable, explaining different levels of respect and courtesy. The porter stood and addressed Sullivan directly. "Driver, that's a 4-year-old child who woke up startled and is crying like children do. The mother is handling it appropriately. There is no need for you to be shouting racist insults or threatening to remove passengers for having crying children. Please just drive the bus and let this woman comfort her daughter in peace." The intervention was calm and reasonable, delivered without aggression or disrespect, simply requesting that Sullivan behave professionally rather than using his position to abuse passengers who depended on his bus to reach their destinations. Sullivan's response to the porter's reasonable request was immediate and hostile. "Mind your own business, or you'll be getting off this bus too. I don't take orders from passengers about how to run my vehicle. If I say a kid needs to shut up, then the kid needs to shut up. If I say a passenger is creating a disturbance, then that passenger is creating a disturbance. And if you don't like how I operate my bus, you can walk to wherever you're going and see if that works better for you." The exchange had now attracted attention from every passenger on the bus, all of whom were witnessing confrontation between racist bus driver and black passengers who were simply trying to use public transportation without being subjected to dehumanizing treatment that violated both basic human decency and official transit authority policies prohibiting discrimination and requiring professional, courteous service regardless of passengers' race or other characteristics that should be irrelevant to whether they received respectful treatment from public employees. At precisely this moment, the bus door opened and Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson boarded, having been waiting at the 125th Street stop when Sullivan closed the doors, leaving 3 passengers behind, and having watched through the bus windows as the confrontation unfolded between the driver and Dorothy Mitchell and the porter who had intervened on her behalf. Bumpy was 48 years old in March 1954, approximately 2 months away from beginning his sentence at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary for drug conspiracy, conviction that would remove him from Harlem for the next 9 years, but still operating with full authority and influence in the neighborhood where he had been protecting residents from various forms of exploitation and abuse for more than 2 decades. Bumpy's presence on the bus immediately changed the atmosphere. Not because he said or did anything threatening, but because his reputation preceded him, and everyone present recognized that Sullivan's racist tantrum was about to encounter consequences that the bus driver had not anticipated when he began insulting a black mother and her child. Have you ever seen the moment when a bully realizes they've chosen the wrong target, when their confidence evaporates, because someone with actual power has entered the situation and is assessing what just happened with expression that promises accountability? Leave a comment about the most satisfying instance of instant justice you've witnessed, and subscribe now because Thomas Sullivan is about to learn that insulting black mothers and calling their children monkeys carries consequences when Bumpy Johnson is watching, and that the next 72 hours will teach every racist bus driver in New York City that their small authority means nothing compared to the organizational power of community that has decided enough is enough. Bumpy walked past Sullivan without acknowledging him, moving toward the back of the bus, where Dorothy sat still, holding Angela, who had finally stopped crying and was now simply looking around with the kind of confused expression children display when they sense tension. But do you understand its source or implications? Bumpy stopped beside Dorothy's seat and spoke quietly, so only she and nearby passengers could hear. "Ma'am, my name is Ellsworth Johnson. I'm sorry you and your daughter experienced this treatment. I need to know your name and how to contact you because what happened here this morning is going to result in changes to how this bus company operates, and I'll need your testimony about what this driver said and did. Are you willing to provide that information and to participate in whatever actions become necessary to ensure this kind of racist abuse does continue?" The request was delivered respectfully, without presuming that Dorothy would automatically agree to involve herself in whatever Bumpy was planning, recognizing that many people preferred to avoid confrontation even when they had been wronged because challenging racist systems often required time and energy and emotional labor that already overburdened people might not be able to provide. Dorothy hesitated, clearly wanting justice but also worried about potential consequences of publicly challenging transit authority employee who possessed institutional power that might be used to retaliate against black passengers who complained about discriminatory treatment. But the memory of Sullivan calling her daughter a monkey and an animal, the memory of being humiliated in front of 60 strangers for the crime of having a crying child, the recognition that remaining silent would allow this behavior to continue happening to other mothers and other children who deserved better treatment than Sullivan had provided. All of these factors combined to overcome Dorothy's hesitation and produced decision to participate in whatever response Bumpy was organizing. "My name is Dorothy Mitchell. I live at 347 West 132nd Street. Apartment for BI, work for 3 families on the Upper East Side, and I afford to lose those jobs if my participation in this creates problems that prevent me from commuting reliably. But I am willing to testify about what happened if you can promise that whatever actions you take on make my situation worse than it already is after being subjected to this racist abuse." Bumpy nodded. My word that you will be protected from any retaliation, and that your participation will not create employment problems or other difficulties. What I'm planning will not involve you publicly unless absolutely necessary for legal proceedings, and even then you'll have representation and support throughout the process. For now, Just write down your contact information and a detailed account of everything that happened from the moment you boarded this bus until this conversation. Include the exact words the driver used, the responses from other passengers, and how the entire incident made you feel. ILL. Collect statements from other witnesses, and WLL. Use all of that documentation to force changes that should have happened long ago, but that required incident like this to catalyze community response. Bumpy then addressed the entire bus, his voice carrying authority that came from decades of leadership in Harlem's community. Everyone on this bus who witnessed what happened here this morning needs to write down their contact information and a brief statement describing what they saw and heard. Pass your information forward, and I'll collect it before you leave the bus. This will be the last time any of you have to tolerate racist abuse from transit. Authority drivers who think they can insult black passengers without consequences. March 26, 1954, 6:15 a.m. New York City Transit Authority bus depots throughout Manhattan, the Bronx, and Brooklyn, where approximately 4,000 bus drivers normally reported for work to begin their daily routes, carrying more than 2 million passengers who depended on public transportation to reach jobs and schools and medical appointments and other essential destinations throughout the metropolitan area. Vast geographic expanse that could not be traversed efficiently without the extensive network of buses and subways that connected neighborhoods and boroughs and allowed city to function despite its size and complexity. But this morning was dramatically different from typical weekday mornings because approximately 3,200 of those 4,000 bus drivers chose not to report for work, creating immediate crisis for transit authority that had no contingency plans for dealing with coordinated absence of 80% of its operating personnel during single morning when demand for transportation services would be highest, and when failure to provide adequate service would disrupt the entire city's economic and social functioning in ways that would attract attention from media and political leaders and general public who rarely notice transportation system's operations until those operations failed catastrophically. Appointments and other essential destinations throughout the metropolitan area's vast geographic expanse that could not be traversed efficiently without the extensive network of buses and subways that connected neighborhoods and boroughs and allowed city to function despite its size and complexity. But this morning was dramatically different from typical weekday mornings because approximately 300 of those 4,000 bus drivers chose not to report for work, creating immediate crisis for transit authority that had no contingency plans for dealing with coordinated absence of 80% of its operating personnel during single morning when demand for transportation services would be highest and when failure to provide adequate service would disrupt the entire city's economic and social functioning in ways that would attract attention from media and political leaders and general public who rarely notice transportation system's operations until those operations failed catastrophically. The bus drivers' coordinated absence was not formal strike organized by their union, which would have violated labor agreements and exposed participants to discipline or termination under collective bargaining contracts that prohibited work stoppages during contract periods. Instead, it was spontaneous epidemic of illness and family emergencies and car troubles and various other legitimate reasons why individual drivers could not report for their shifts on March 26th, specifically, creating situation where transit authority management could not prove coordination or punish participants without evidence that the simultaneous absences were planned rather than coincidental. The absence would have been devastating enough on its own, but it was compounded by a simultaneous problem that made the morning's transportation crisis even worse. Approximately black passengers who normally rode buses during morning rush hour also chose not to use public transportation on March 26th, instead walking to their destinations or arranging carpools or simply staying home rather than patronizing system that had tolerated racist abuse from drivers who insulted black mothers and called their children monkeys without facing any consequences from management. That should have been enforcing professional standards and preventing discriminatory treatment of passengers who paid the same fares as everyone else but received inferior service. The coordinated action by drivers and passengers had been organized over 72 hours through a network of churches and community organizations and informal communication channels that existed throughout Harlem and other black neighborhoods in New York City. mobilized by Bumpy Johnson, working with religious leaders and civil rights activists and union organizers who recognized that Thomas Sullivan's racist tantrum on the M7 bus represented opportunity to challenge systemic racism that characterized transit authority operations despite official policies prohibiting discrimination. Bumpy had collected statements from 42 passengers who witnessed Sullivan's behavior, documented similar incidents involving other drivers who had abused black passengers without consequences, and presented comprehensive evidence to transit authority management demonstrating pattern of racist conduct that violated both city regulations and basic standards of professional behavior. When transit authority officials dismissed his complaints and suggested that Sullivan's behavior had been inappropriate but not serious enough to warrant discipline beyond verbal warning, Bumpy proceeded with alternative strategy that would demonstrate exactly how much power black community possessed when it chose to exercise that power through coordinated action rather than through official channels that had consistently failed to address racist abuse. If you're feeling what transit authority management felt on the morning of March 26th, when they realized that 80% of their buses were UNT running and 60,000 passengers were UNT riding because one racist driver had insulted a black mother and the community had decided to respond with demonstration of economic power that paralyzed the entire city as transportation system, then you need to hit that like button and subscribe right now, because what happened over the next 48 hours proved that Bumpy Johnson understood something fundamental about power in America, that people who provided essential services could shut down entire systems without violence or vandalism simply by refusing to participate. And that black economic power was enormous when mobilized strategically, even though racist assumptions led white authorities to believe that black people lacked the organizational capacity or collective discipline necessary to sustain coordinated resistance to discriminatory treatment. By 9 a.m. on March 26th, New York City was experiencing transportation catastrophe that dominated news coverage and created political crisis for Mayor Robert Wagner Jr., whose administration was responsible for transit authority operations and who faced immediate pressure from business leaders and commuters and media outlets, demanding explanation for why buses were UNT running and demanding immediate restoration of normal service that millions of people depended on for daily mobility. The crisis was compounded by fact that subway system was also experiencing unusual overcrowding, as passengers who normally rode buses attempted to use underground trains instead, creating dangerous conditions on platforms and in cars where people were packed so tightly that normal safety protocols could not be maintained. By noon, Wagner had called emergency meeting with transit authority leadership and union representatives and community leaders, including Bumpy Johnson, to determine what had caused the crisis and how normal operations could be restored quickly enough to prevent economic damage that was accumulating. With each hour that passed without adequate transportation services, the meeting occurred at City Hall in conference room, where Wagner and Transit Authority Chairman Charles Patterson sat across from Bumpy Johnson and Reverend Thomas Henderson of the Abyssinian Baptist Church and labor leader William Davis, who represented Transit Workers Union. Wagner opened the meeting by demanding explanation for what had happened and who was responsible for coordinating the action that had paralyzed the city's transportation system. Bumpy responded calmly, without defensiveness or apology. Mr. Mayor, what happened this morning is natural consequence of transit authority tolerating racist abuse from drivers who insult black passengers without facing any meaningful discipline. On March 23rd, driver named Thomas Sullivan called a black child a monkey and an animal, humiliated the child's mother in front of 60 witnesses, and threatened to remove passengers from his bus for the crime of having a crying child. When I reported this incident to Transit Authority Management and requested that Sullivan be disciplined, I was told that his behavior was inappropriate, but not serious enough to warrant suspension or termination. That response communicated clearly that Transit Authority does not take racist abuse seriously and does not consider black passengers deserving of the same professional, courteous service that white passengers receive routinely. Bumpy continued. So this morning, approximately 3,000 transit workers, many of them white, incidentally decided they were too sick or too busy with family emergencies to drive buses for employer that tolerates racism among its personnel. And approximately 60,000 black passengers decided they would rather walk to work or stay home than ride buses operated by company that allows drivers to call their children monkeys. without consequences. These were individual choices made by thousands of independent people who decided simultaneously that participating in racist system was unacceptable. If you want bus service to resume tomorrow morning, you have two options. First option is to fire Thomas Sullivan and implement comprehensive anti-discrimination training for all drivers and establish clear disciplinary procedures for racist conduct that make absolutely certain no driver ever calls a black child a monkey again without losing their job immediately. Second option is to continue experiencing the kind of transportation crisis you're experiencing today, except it will last for weeks or months rather than being resolved after a single day of disruption. Wagner and Patterson exchanged glances, clearly understanding that Bumpy's characterization of situation was accurate and that their only realistic choice was accepting his demands or watching City's transportation system remain paralyzed indefinitely by coordinated resistance that transit authority lacked resources or authority to overcome through legal action or operational changes that did instead address underlying problem of racism among drivers. Patterson spoke carefully. "Mr. Johnson, what happened to Mrs. Mitchell and her daughter was unacceptable, and I apologize on behalf of Transit Authority for Mr. Sullivan's conduct. We will terminate his employment effective immediately, and we will implement mandatory anti-discrimination training for all drivers beginning next week. We will also establish complaint procedures that make it easier for passengers to report discriminatory treatment and that ensure such complaints are investigated thoroughly and result in appropriate discipline when violations are confirmed. Will these measures be sufficient to restore normal operations tomorrow morning?" Bumpy considered Patterson's offer, recognizing that the proposed changes represented genuine improvement over previous policies that had tolerated racist abuse without meaningful consequences. "Those measures are acceptable as starting point, Mr. Patterson. But I want one additional change implemented immediately. I want Transit Authority to hire 50 new black drivers within next 90 days. Because currently your workforce does not reflect demographics of city you serve, and because having more black drivers will help establish culture where racist conduct by white drivers is less likely to be tolerated or excused. Can you commit to that hiring goal?" The demand for affirmative hiring represented expansion beyond original focus on disciplining Thomas Sullivan, but it addressed systemic racism that characterized Transit Authority employment practices, where black New Yorkers were overwhelmingly passengers rather than operators, despite being qualified for driving positions that would provide better wages and working conditions than the domestic service and manual labor jobs that most black workers could access in discriminatory employment market that existed in 1954 New York. Patterson hesitated, clearly recognizing that committing to hire 50 black drivers within 90 days would require overcoming resistance from union representatives and management personnel who preferred maintaining all-white workforce that had characterized Transit Authority operations for decades. But he also recognized that refusing Bumpy's demand would probably result in continuation of transportation crisis that was costing city millions of dollars per day and creating political problems for Wagner's administration that could affect upcoming elections. "I commit to hiring 50 qualified black drivers within 90 days, subject to normal hiring procedures and requirements that apply to all driver applicants regardless of race. Is that acceptable?" Bumpy nodded. "That's acceptable. Normal operations will resume tomorrow morning. Thank you for meeting with me and for agreeing to changes that should have been implemented years ago without requiring crisis to force action." If you want to discover more stories about how Bumpy Johnson forced institutional change without violence, without breaking laws, without doing anything except organizing communities and demonstrating economic power that racist authorities had assumed didn't exist, subscribe to this channel and leave your like. So more people learn that in 1954, racist bus driver's insult to black mother triggered response that paralyzed New York City and forced changes to transportation system that benefited millions of passengers, while proving once again that the smartest victories come from strategic organizing rather than from individual retaliation against people who abuse whatever authority society grants them. Thomas Sullivan was terminated from Transit Authority employment on March 27, 1954, becoming the first New York City bus driver ever fired specifically for racist conduct toward passengers rather than for safety violations or criminal behavior or other infractions that had traditionally been considered serious enough to warrant dismissal. The termination was widely publicized in black newspapers and discussed in churches and community organizations throughout Harlem and other neighborhoods where residents recognized that Sullivan's firing represented genuine progress toward accountability for racist abuse that had previously been tolerated without consequences. The mandatory anti-discrimination training that Transit Authority implemented for all drivers, beginning in April 1954, became model for similar programs adopted by other municipal agencies and private employers throughout New York City during following years as civil rights movement gained momentum, and as businesses recognized that tolerating racism created legal liability and public relations problems that far exceeded costs of implementing better policies and training programs. The 50 black drivers hired between April and June 1954 represented beginning of diversification of Transit Authority workforce that would accelerate during following decades as federal civil rights legislation and changing social attitudes made discrimination in employment increasingly unacceptable and legally risky. Many of those 50 drivers went on to long careers with Transit Authority, eventually rising to supervisory and management positions where they helped establish culture that was more respectful of black passengers and more intolerant of racist conduct by drivers or other personnel who might have preferred maintaining the discriminatory practices that had characterized previous generations. Dorothy Mitchell never rode Thomas Sullivan's bus again, but she continued using public transportation daily to reach her domestic service jobs on Upper East Side, and she later reported that her experiences with Transit Authority drivers improved noticeably after Sullivan's termination and implementation of anti-discrimination training that made clear racist insults toward passengers would result in immediate employment termination rather than verbal warnings that communicated management's indifference to discriminatory conduct. The story of how Bumpy Johnson responded to racist bus driver's insult became legendary in Harlem and beyond, told as example of how strategic community organizing and coordination between different groups could produce systemic change that benefited everyone who had experienced similar abuse without having resources or influence to challenge institutional racism independently. The incident demonstrated that Bumpy's power derived not just from his control over criminal enterprises, but also from his deep connections throughout Harlem's community and his ability to mobilize diverse constituencies, from church congregations to labor unions to ordinary passengers who were willing to walk to work, rather than accept continued racist abuse toward common goals that required sustained collective action rather than individual complaints that authorities could easily dismiss or ignore. The paralysis of New York City's bus system for a single morning in March 1954 proved that black economic power was enormous when exercised strategically, and that communities tired of tolerating discrimination possessed capabilities that far exceeded what racist assumptions led authorities to expect from people they had dismissed as powerless and incapable of effective resistance to institutional abuse. Bumpy Johnson left for Alcatraz in May 1954, approximately 6 weeks after resolving the Transit Authority crisis, beginning 9-year incarceration that would remove him from Harlem during crucial years of civil rights movement, when Rosa Parks and Montgomery bus boycott and other transportation protests would demonstrate nationwide what Bumpy had demonstrated localized. Coordinated refusal to participate in racist systems created economic and political pressure that forced institutional change more effectively than individual complaints or legal challenges that took years to resolve through courts that moved slowly and often ruled against plaintiffs challenging deeply entrenched discriminatory practices. When Bumpy returned to Harlem in 1963, the neighborhood had changed dramatically during his absence. But stories about how he had paralyzed New York City's transportation system to defend black mother insulted by a racist bus driver remained vivid in community memory, told as example of the kind of leadership and strategic thinking that characterized his long career protecting Harlem's residents from various forms of exploitation and abuse that white society tolerated until forced to acknowledge that tolerance carried costs, exceeded benefits of maintaining racist status quo that had persisted for generations despite being morally indefensible and practically unsustainable once. Black Americans decided collectively that enough was enough.